Hi, I'm Sally Gregson from Mill Cottage Plants, and I'm here today to tell you a bit about propagating ferns. On this cold, windy January day, the conditions are actually perfect for taking cuttings or fernlets from the leaves and the fronds of certain ferns. So, Polystichum setiferum, this is actually Plumoso divisilobum. A bit of a long mouthful, isn't it, for a poor little plant. This actually does produce little fernlets on the fronds. But this particular plant I propagated exactly 2 years ago, and it's just not old enough to produce the little fernlets. So I have a friend, and she very kindly has offered me her fernlets. So we're going to use those. But eventually, in 2 years' time, this will look like that. It'll actually be grown and looking good. So over here, I have some fernlets, which are great. I'm just finding a good one that you can see properly. You see along the rib, there are all these little fresh green, tiny little leaves, and those are actually the leaves of these new ferns, which this plant has made. Were you to leave it on the plant, not worry about it, the leaf itself would start to die. It already has started to die, and would sort of go back into the soil, and maybe a few of these would root. But you can actually take shortcuts and you can cheat the plant. So what we do is maybe to take some young fronds with a few tiny little fernlets along the leaves and lay it down carefully on this tray, which I've actually filled up with a mixture of potting compost, all-purpose potting compost, to about 50%, 25% washed grit. It must be washed. Don't ever use other sorts of grit for horticultural purposes. It's too salty and it reverses the osmosis. And I've also got some propagation-mix bark, which is very fine, so it doesn't interfere with anything else. And this is the perfect combination for actually propagating. So I sort of press it down very carefully into this mix, and then I get some grit. And in order to keep the leaf in contact with the soil, I'm going to put some grit over the top, very carefully, just to pin it down so it doesn't go walkabout when I water it. And then I shall put it down on the ground and I shall water the whole thing from on top to settle the whole thing down. And then I'll put it inside my greenhouse, on the ground probably, underneath the shelves. It does not want to get scorched with any sun that we suddenly get, believe it or not. So that's one lot, and hopefully by about sort of, let me think, April maybe, May possibly, you'll find that the little fernlets will have really started to push up, and they also would have rooted into the compost mixture. And once you've got plenty of roots on them, and not before, you can then tip them out and pop them up into small pots, into a good mixture of potting compost, and then water them in, label each one, and put it somewhere to stand, somewhere in the shade where it's going to get looked after. However, you can take slight shortcuts. It's a little bit more fiddly, but well worth it. And for this, I'm going to use more of this soil, which is a really good fine mix. And I'm going to fill all of these little pots, little plugs rather, with the mixture. I'm actually taking out any big lumpy bits or fibrous bits because they won't work very well, and fill the whole thing right up to the brim. Until we're really happy. Be careful how you lift it up, it might go through the bottom. And basically brush off the top. Now, with these bigger pieces, or the bigger little fernlets, I'm going to cut them up. The wind is quite bad today. I'm sure you can hear it's bad, and it's blowing everything around, so it's not good. So in order to get the fernlets off this, you can see how the whole frond is actually dying back now, so the fernlets really are ready to go. I cut just above each one and maybe leave a bit underneath so I can pop it in the plug, but not too much. That's a little bit too much. Two. I think that's not there anymore, and we take off these Manchio leaves. And pop them with your pen perhaps, or God's dibber, into each one of the holes. You don't need any rooting compost, it's perfectly happy to root. It's rooting actually from this point here, not from down here, so the rooting powder wouldn't make any difference. Pop it in there, and then fill the whole tray up with all these little fernlets, which takes quite a while, I have to say. And then again, you need to make a label with the details of what you've done and how many you've done. This is a tray of 30, so hopefully I'll get 30. Pop it up there. You don't need to put any grit on because they're all well into the plugs, so they're not going to go running around anywhere. And then take it down, water it really well, let it settle down, and put it under the bench in the greenhouse. You could use a cold frame if you haven't got a greenhouse. It's perfectly okay. They're fairly hardy, providing you don't live in northern Scotland or somewhere. They're fine. And they should root again pretty quickly, probably by about April, May. And you can tell because when you look underneath, you'll see that the roots are coming through the bottom. Not before it does that. Make sure there's plenty of root. Pot it up into these little pots, whatever size you like, but not too much bigger than that. And then it will settle down and grow. And you'll have quite a nice little fern, which will be big enough almost to put in the ground by the autumn. So there's quite a quick way of doing it. And for that reason, these plants are really pretty accessible, and you can buy them in the garden centre. But take a tip from me, when you buy them, just have a look at the leaves and see if they've got any fernlets on them. This particular fern is wonderful for shade, for dry shade, underneath trees, which is really useful. It's a good plant. So all the Polystichum setiferum do fairly dry shade, and that's a real virtue. I hope you have a go at them. Thank you.